The types of fraudsters that are doing this are not like, you know, a kid hacking around in his bedroom. Like these are like organized industrial, truly organized or organized criminal activity or nation state activity that's doing this, and they're thinking about this as ROI and probability of capture. So it is very scary, just the sort of technology S curve that we're in. And yeah, to your point earlier, Peter, like I think identity, broadly speaking, is like an important piece to sort of countermeasuring that.
Hey there, it's Mike Langford. Welcome to another episode of the 6x6 Lock Podcast, a secure money movement podcast for the private markets. On this episode of the show, Peter Steppe and I are joined by Vivek Ahuja, director of the financial institutions vertical at Persona, the leading provider of identity solutions to help companies verify that people are who they say they are. Vivek and Peter shine a light on why private equity firms and other large companies are frequently the targets of international crime rings and even state-sponsored attackers looking to score big financial wins, and what you can do to protect your firm. This is really important stuff. You're going to get a ton out of this episode. Now, before we get to the conversation, please do make sure you subscribe to the 6x6 Lock Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, the YouTubes, or wherever you get your podcast jam on. And if you have a question or a suggestion for a topic or a guest, hit us up. Shoot us an email, podcast@6lock.com. Okay, let's get to the conversation with Vivek Ahuja. Well, Vivek Ahuja, Peter Steppe, so wonderful to see you both. Welcome to this 6x6 Lock Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being.
Well, it's fantastic to see you guys. It's great. So, we're all pumped up today. Lots of interesting stuff is happening in the world, and we might actually get into some like geopolitical stuff and how it might affect the threats to modern businesses today, and particularly for private markets, those who are moving lots of money. There's lots of bad actors out there. But I thought we kind of kick things off in a different way. I want to get a little bit about your background, Vivek, because you have an amazing backstory. You were an actual nuclear submarine officer, kind of keeping the world safe in a different way back in the day. So I wonder if you kind of chart a course for us a little bit so the audience can understand, like, how does somebody who used to be working on nuclear naval submarines find his way into Persona, like keeping the world safe in a different way?
Yeah. I won't do like a full resume style background here, but yeah, one of the funny things I say is like people that work in this sort of like compliance, risk, identity, fraud, this sort of ecosystem, trust and safety, anti-abuse, this sort of adversarial problem space is like everyone just sort of finds their way into it. You don't go to college and major in anti-fraud management or identity fraud. It's not a college major. Everyone sort of finds their way into it through different ways. Yeah, I mean, I think just to connect the dots there. Yeah, I did start. Chapter one of my career was as a Navy submarine officer, and I think ended up actually finding my way into this, believe it or not, through entrepreneurship. So when I left the Navy, I went, did what a lot of naval officers do, go to business school because we have no idea what you're going to do after the military. Yeah. It's a good sort of proving ground or a testing ground for stuff. Ended up actually starting a payments company in Southeast Asia named SentiLink, and really just drank from the fire hose of fraud. For folks that are watching this and that have worked in like payments or risk know that Southeast Asia is a really tough market when it comes to fraud losses and the sorts of bad actors there, and just was figuring it out on the fly without having any sort of formal background in the space, but was able to use like first principles thinking around math and network analysis and basic analytics to sort of piece together something. Ended up, after that period, ended up being part of the early risk team at Affirm, buy now, pay later company. where one of the co-founders at Affirm thought my background was interesting because I was in the Navy. And so, right, his belief was just like, if you can drive a submarine and operate a nuclear power plant, we can teach you how to write SQL and MongoDB queries and do fraud investigations. Like, you'll be fine. And so I think that was, yeah, it's probably like the nice way to sum up that multi-year arc to get me here. Yeah.
That's pretty wild. That's pretty wild. Peter, I've never asked you, like, how did you navigate getting here to the security world? I'm sure I could go on LinkedIn and look it up, but like, what was your path? I mean, I'm sure it was a little bit different, but where did your interest and excitement for the space arrive?
Yeah, no, similar to what Vivek said, I don't think anyone in college says, oh, I'm going to go into that field, but computer science in college, and then went into Silicon Valley working for RSA Security pretty soon after I graduated. And that was enterprise security. We were doing authentication and encryption back in the early days of the internet, late 90s, Silicon Valley. So just kind of blossomed from there. And great company to work for, obviously, in the security space. Great clientele in the financial institutions, and then other clients in the public sector and things like that.
Wow, that was interesting. So, Vivek, you said something that was really interesting to me, and I want to dive into it in a little deeper level here. You talked about, your part of your career arc there, you started digging into some first principles of this type of stuff. And for those I'm sure everybody knows what first principles are, but if they need a refresher, like, these are things that are always going to be true, no matter what. Like, these are principles that you can bank things on. Jeff Bezos famously said, the first principles are that people are always going to want to have cheaper prices, and they're always going to want to have stuff delivered quicker and easier and all that type of stuff. Like, those things are always going to be true. It doesn't matter what business it is. And it's kind of like, okay, I can build everything else around that. So it's kind of an interesting way to think about security, right? And the threats that are out there, because as you guys mentioned in our prep call, and I can't remember who teed it up, but you said that there's no PhD. You were actually talking about it a little bit. Like, you can't really get a PhD in this security / threat paradigm we're dealing with here. So I wonder if we can kind of dive into it. Like, why don't you talk about what you see as some of the first principles in this space to think about, so that we can kind of create a good landscape for those in the audience.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that is really important is identity. In the kind of age of AI that we're in now, the threat landscape is shifting dramatically, very quickly. We all kind of see the impersonation that can be done with AI. So really being able to establish as a first principle who's on the other side of a transaction in the financial space, I think is a really key first principle to focus on. So it's not just having the right information, but being able to prove identity as well.
Yeah, I would actually say for this, I think about it a little bit more like from an academic standpoint, which is like just going back to like, the framing you had earlier, Mike, that like there's no PhD in like anti-fraud, there's no PhD in identity risk. Or like, at least there's no well-known PhDs in this space. Maybe there's an obscure university that offers this, but there's not really like, there's no Nobel laureate for this. But, I think some of the disciplines that I think about where you do start to see the tradecraft start to form, like obviously a lot of sort of computer science and machine learning and kind of tying to statistics, a lot of those principles. I mean, I would guess there's decades worth of research papers that have to do with network analysis for fraud detection, just because it's applied in so many other sort of adversarial kind of capacities. The other one I think about is like economics. So you're right, thinking about like fraud as like kind of like a market that responds to incentives and responds to like the obvious one that, is in recent past for a lot of us is like COVID-19, obviously, but all the like government benefits programs where fraudsters were just defrauding states and federal governments and all manner of institutions. And that's a market response to a market distortion and an incentive that was put out there. So I think like sort of thinking around those principles. The other one I think about is like, this also actually does tie to a Nobel laureate, George Akerlof, like UC Berkeley professor, famous for this, his body of work was around lemon laws for cars in like the late 1970s, I think is when he wrote the paper. But, the first principle there is like, anytime there can be a strategy to defraud people in a market, or anytime that any potential market has structure where people can be exploited or where market participants can be sort of bad actors, the first principle is that there will be fraud. There will be like kind of tricks played on people. Like if the incentive exists, it will be exploited.
100%. It's so funny. It's kind of like if you're a retail company, you actually expect something called shrinkage, right? There's going to be theft. It just happens, right? Everybody understands that's going to happen. Anybody who has a cash-based business, going back, if anybody remember your business school days, you talked about that. Like, okay, there's going to be shrinkage at the till, right? Somebody's going to misplace a 20 somehow, or a few dollars here and there, and it's going to happen. Well, it's going to happen in this level, particularly at the digital level. People are going to find some stuff. And one of the things that, you were talking about during our prep call was that fraud is just a numbers game. It's a huge probability that these actors are working on. And, it's everybody remembers those Nigerian prince emails we all got back in the day. But now with AI, things are expanding and accelerating. Walk us through like why the probability framing changes the way we should be thinking about defense here.
Yeah. I mean, just to go back to first principles, anytime you move money around on the internet, there's going to be people that also steal it. That's a little bit more of a casual first principle. And actually, Peter may have seen this, right? RSA, you said, coming up in that era of Silicon Valley, like people, I mean, at least for me, elder millennial here, I do remember starting to use email and all those sort of Nigerian print scams. I think they were called 409 scams back in the day, or some number scam, just referring to those types back in the day. And right, those were not very believable tricks. Like I think most people can, if your email archive goes that far, you can just go find some examples or something on X. Like pretty obvious that those stories were not very credible. But at the end of the day, like those are technology enabled, and those scammers or fraudsters only needed a minuscule percentage of people receiving those emails to respond to them and think that they were credible. And so really, when you're talking about technology enabled fraud, it is a numbers game. Like if you're talking about being able to send millions of those emails or hundreds of thousands, you only need one or two to hit for it to be like, worth the ROI. But yeah, I mean, Peter, to your point earlier, the sort of like changing the game with AI, like even if you can just increase the scale, if you can increase the probability of a response or the desired outcome from 0.01% to 0.02%, like that's meaningful ROI for like, a fraudster. And the types of fraudsters that are doing this are not like, a kid hacking around in his bedroom. Like these are like organized industrial, truly organized or organized criminal activity or nation state activity that's doing this. And they're thinking about this as ROI and probability of capture. So it is very scary, just the sort of technology S-curve that we're in. And yeah, to your point earlier, Peter, like I think identity, broadly speaking, is like an important piece to sort of countermeasuring that.
Yeah, I would just add that I think in the private market space, it's, sometimes we think about fraud as like them just skimming off one or two smaller transactions. With these larger transactions, I think it's something where they sit and they watch for a while and then they're waiting for a capital movement. And so in this threat landscape environment that we're in with private markets, the cost is way higher of a bad event because you're moving so much money in a short amount of time. So just one of the unique aspects of that market that I don't think people quite understand. They think about fraud kind of in other arenas, but in this arena in particular, it's about impersonation and waiting for a capital movement.
Yeah, it's funny, Peter, you just teed up something that we talked about in our prior conversation that really deserves kind of some unpacking there, right? Is we talked about the private equity money movement problem in a way that I don't think our audiences really fully appreciated and maybe not heard so cleanly before. You said that when you think about fraud risk spectrum of payments, most solutions are built for one or two scenarios. High dollar, low frequency transactions, right? Where everyone's paying, very close attention, like mortgage closings and, where every party has kind of like hyper vigilance. And then you had these low dollar, high frequency transactions, right? That you were just describing, Peter, and Vivek, you alluded to. But now because of PE is like, hey, we've got these high dollar movements and high frequency, and in some cases high urgency, like, hey, this has got to get done today. Mm-hmm. This really opens up the opportunity for fraud a lot more, right? What are your thoughts on that, and how do you think about that problem, Vivek?
Even the two different sort of like scenarios you described, even if you think back to some of those first quote unquote first principles, like, yeah, right, when we think about like payments fraud or card fraud, like there's actually quite a bit of data there to go build predictive models as well. You think about this from like a statistical standpoint, you can get labels and build sort of meaningfully accurate, right, models for that. But yeah, a private equity sort of like a closing process, I've never worked in that industry. I've never been a party to sort of like an, LP to GP or one of those sort of transactions. So Peter could probably speak to that, better than me. But right, my sort of framing for this was thinking about the like very small number of times I've done like angel investments into friends' companies. And it's always like, hey, here's a bunch of paperwork that you're going to review. Yes, I'm in. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you get a bunch of texts that are like, hey, you got to wire the money tomorrow. Yeah. And it's like real urgency. Like the round's closing tomorrow and like you need to wire it tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Or you need to wire it in 2 days. And so it is this like, almost like a perfect storm of like, of bad. But, Peter, yeah, maybe if you want to describe sort of what it looks like for, a private equity investor, right? That's not my, expertise.
Yeah. That was a really good description to start with. I think that's kind of the process, it's hurry up and wait because they're all trying to close a deal. And then, okay, now I need to talk to my LPs and bring the money in, right? Because the deal closed. So when it happens very quickly. One of the things with Six Lock that we've designed is a way to get ahead of that, to prepare for it so that you're not scrambling around at the last minute. I think in studying kind of the fraud environment, when there's a sense of urgency and a heightened need to move quickly, people make mistakes that fraudsters can exploit. So, I think using amazing tools like Persona and what we've done with Six Lock is to try to get ahead of that problem so you're prepared way before it happens, instead of kind of being so reactionary like a lot of people are today.
Let's unpack that concept of preparedness before, because actually this is the second day in a row. We recorded another episode of this show yesterday with Todd Sorrell and Jeff Wilkinson, who is the founder of two banks, by the way. Okay? But we were talking about this concept of moving money from bank account to bank account and the risk, as you just described, Peter, of like, all of a sudden, hey, it's time to move money. And people haven't really thought through, like, because we've all been there, like, oh, by the way, it's at closing. Now tell me where to send the money, right? And it's like, well, we should have talked about like how I'm going to pay you earlier in this conversation, and both have agreement like what the accounts look like and so forth, and done something there. So let's walk through that concept of like being ready before the day comes.
So first off, I would say when you have a private equity kind of situation, you've got the general partner and you've got the limited partners. A lot of times there's a fund admin involved as well. So when you bring your LPs on initially, you do it through subdocs and you might collect some banking information from them at that time. And then the problem is you can't really tie that to someone's identity in real time when the transaction's taking place. That's what 6lock does. We use Persona to help us with that. So being able to establish not only the correct banking information, but who is the person behind it. That's the real key.
I guess that's a great segue into like, how does 6lock and Persona work together to kind of like create this identity backbone, right? Because it's funny, like, I don't think a lot of people think about it too much, right? But like, hey, look, I have a bank account. My business has a bank account. Great. I know the bank account information for both of those things. If I need to move money, I can go into my bank and send money to wherever you tell me to send money to, but I need to make sure that it's the right person, right? Or the right company, right? So walk us through, like, how does Persona work? And then I guess, well, obviously, Vivek, that's your, but like, and how does the interaction between that and what 6lock is doing work?
So I'll just say having software or a platform to do this is better than my typical approach, which is just constant state of paranoia anytime I'm moving lots of money. And it's considerably probably less mentally taxing. But I think just to your point, like, a lot of fraud and risk, like, yes, there's transactional signals, there's like payment related, sort of payment instrument signals or bank account related signals, but a substantial portion of like risk is determined from like identity related signals, like there's a whole bunch of data that comes out of like an email, a phone. These are all identity. These are all like pieces of a consumer's identity. Obviously, right, when you're starting to get into more higher assurance forms of identity, like getting documents, like a driver's license or a picture or an image of a person, that creates all sorts of data signals that are extracted off of that, or information off their device, the phone that they're using, even the browser, even the orientation of the phone, right? Will give you a bunch of sort of passive signals to determine these. And so, the way that I think about Persona is like we're really providing that, like, depending on the level of depth you want to go with identity related signals, types of experiences you want to create to go collect that data or make sense of it, or incorporate it into other workflows. Like, really, that's where Persona does shine. And Peter, you're probably best to speak to like how 6lock is integrating it, but we are providing a lot of that the identity related backbone that helps provide that sort of predictive value.
Yeah, I think we see it as the best tool in the market for a variety of different things, and we've integrated it into the 6lock solution for our clients. And really, there's multiple things that you need to do to secure a financial transaction. You need strong authentication, you need identity verification, you need authorization, and then you need an audit and tracking capability. So Persona really helps us on the identity side. There's also some other fraud signals that they can provide that help our clients to identify fraud. So yeah, I think it's a very powerful solution, the combination of the two.
It's pretty wild. And it bears like kind of reminding the viewer or the listener here that's like all this stuff should be thought of ahead of time. like you're working to, using a Persona, like verifying identity and so forth, like ahead of time, right? And it sounds goofy. It's like, well, I know that, Vivek's going to be sending me money. So I know it's him, and it's me that's sending the email. But as we said, there's lots of threats that can get into that ecosystem, and I'm going to explore them a little bit more in depth here in a second. But knowing ahead of time that, okay, we have decided like this is where the money goes, and this is everybody's been validated and authenticated ahead of time is huge. And Vivek, you said one thing that just really popped into my mind. Like, I think everybody listening to or watching can identify this is, identifying the phone, right? Mm-hmm. I've had the same phone number since the 90s, my cell phone. I can't get rid of it. I live in Austin, but it's a Boston phone number because I grew up in the Boston area. Excuse me, it's my first cell phone. I'm never going to get rid of it. But we have issues where like bad actors can spoof phone numbers and things like that. So it seems like a good way to tee up a more expansive conversation on this, because we've been dealing with for a long time humans try to fool humans, right? But now AI, we've talked about all the things that you can use AI to do to fool the human. But are we now getting into a scenario where like AIs might fool your AI and help you and try to defraud you that way as well?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think we're soon going to be past the using AI to just summarize blocks of text for us or draft up
Right.
like emails for us and read text. Yeah, I mean, I think this is very top of mind for anyone that's in the industry of commerce or just trust more broadly speaking. I'm a little bit more in tune to more on commerce side and thinking about moving money around, and you're right, obviously Six Lock is looking at this too. But yeah, I mean, I do think that we're, when it comes to AI, right, I do think we're probably close to like climbing this adoption curve of agentic commerce, which is
Yeah.
obviously a very hot topic right now. I think a lot of people were predicting, 2025, 2026, is this the year where we start to see meaningful adoption? And I think in the US, I think we're still early on that curve, but you can find examples, if you look out, pick your head up and look outside of the United States, right? There's meaningful, right, agentic commerce transactions. You're starting to see that curve climb in geos like China. I just read an article from a few weeks back talking about, right, there was a citation of over 100 million agentic sort of purchases had been done for a coffee shop in China for like one of their apps. And so you are starting to see that, and you're starting to see some of that start to happen. And, at Persona, we are involved heavily in sort of the ecosystem of understanding, right? Identity is going to be a piece of this, like digital identity, KYA or know your agent sort of frameworks, and, wanting to be part of that and some of that standard setting that's being done across the payments ecosystem with the networks and, large issuing banks and large acquiring banks. I think, the other piece to this is, trying to predict what the standard should be ahead of time, but then also keeping your ear to the ground when you do start to see some of these adoption use cases and starting to sort of like Silicon Valley principle is like ship and then pivot like along the way, and understanding sort of like what the new threat vectors are going to be, what the new abuse and fraud problems are going to be, because anytime there's a new way to transact, there's always like a new way to defraud, unfortunately, or a new way to abuse it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another aspect of the whole AI equation that I think people should be focused on is that it's a very powerful tool in the bad actors' hands as well. And a good example of that is with voice cloning these days. So like Vivek said before, like voice cloning 5 or 10 years ago was there, but it wasn't very good, right? Like you could tell that it was kind of fake. Now it's high fidelity. It's really good. With 3 seconds of my voice sample from this podcast, you can try to impersonate me. So those type of uses of AI in a threat actor's hands kind of make old processes, like where you're calling your LPs to verify their banking information, like a voice callback, that becomes obsolete super quick. You can't do that anymore.
I jokingly said, like, I sort of operate in this constant state of paranoia sometimes if you've worked in this space long enough. It was just, and actually this ties to Peter, what you shared earlier about being able to use voice agents and voice cloning. Like, there are people out there, just even as a consumer, right, or just, not acting as like a business fraud leader or private equity principal or something. Like, even just in your day-to-day interactions, like, you probably get hit with scammers, like phone calls, texts, etc. Like, there are people out there that like to engage with it. Like, maybe you're just having a bad day and you're actually just going to talk to that scammer. Yeah. And maybe you're going to say a bunch of snarky stuff. Maybe you're going to curse them out. Maybe you're going to like drag them along and try to trick them. Or maybe you'll text back something snarky. Like, don't do that just right, just a few seconds of them knowing like what your voice sounds like or the tone of your text, like
Yeah.
that's just data that you're giving away for free to a criminal actor. And so
Yeah.
and they can use that, right, to try to clone your voice or just detect things in your signature, detect things that right. So it's like sort of constantly thinking about the counterparties that you interact with day to day in a business or personal context, like is really is really important.
It's such smart advice because the temptation is real, Vivek. I tell you, anyways, there's, and maybe I'll link it up in the show notes. There's a TED Talk video of a guy, and it's famous. This thing's got millions and millions of views, of this guy who gets one of those Nigerian prince emails, right? And he's like, screw it, I've got time, let's reply. And he has this comedic long, like months long, back and forth with the person about moving gold, and it's really hilarious. And it could be tempting because we have all been tempted. But I think your point is spot on, because what you're saying is every little bit of information you give a bad actor gives him a little bit more data to potentially act, and whether it's impersonate you or have that one more piece of information that they need to hack an account or whatever. So just be really, really careful.
Yeah, or use your voice to go call
Yeah.
your company's HR and say, "Yeah, we need to change the bank account for my payroll run."
Yeah.
Right? You can sound exactly like you and spoof your phone number, right? It's because you've given that data away. So it is really interesting to think about it that way.
Yeah.
And paranoid. Hopefully, you could still sleep at night. Okay.
What are we gonna call? We need a new term for this. Like, is it like functionally paranoid? Some sort of like be paranoidly vigilant. I don't know what that is, but the old saying of like, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. So
Yeah, I would say a lot of people kind of deal with this day to day in their lives now, so they are kind of aware of it. They're not as often maybe aware that there are solutions to these problems in the market that you can go get, like 6lock, to make yourself more secure, right? And the bad actors are always going to go after the lowest hanging fruit. They're going to go after the weakest targets. So try not to put yourself in that situation, because there are some really great tools out there to help you, and solicit that help. I think it's important.
it's so interesting and scary, but really interesting too, to just think about this. I mean, it's like a lot of people don't think about how small most private equity and private market firms are, right? They're most of them are not thousands and thousands of people with huge, robust, security teams and so forth. You'd be surprised that some of them might just be 20 folks in a team, right? And anytime you have small teams, I guess big teams as well, people start to try to leverage technologies to get more efficient or whatever. And so AI is being brought in-house to do a lot of things to make the office a little more efficient. And of course, a lot of the LPs are probably doing the same thing on their end. Mm-hmm. And so there's this opportunity kind of to open up a threat vector that they didn't realize, right? Because they're taking their personal eyes off of stuff and turning it over to some sort of agentic AI to do some things and make it more efficient. So what we're hearing is be very careful and pay attention. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Vivek, that really kind of got me thinking here, that I want to make sure we kind of dive into a little more in depth. And it also kind of dovetails into some current events that we're seeing at the time of this recording. And I suspect by the time this goes live, it'll be still going on. This is not a new thing. Is that you mentioned that earlier in your career you start in Southeast Asia. You a lot of payment stuff there. You saw a lot of fraud there, and then you brought it back a little bit later that they're like enterprise grade threat actors, right? These are companies that are well organized, almost basically like organized crime. Well, not basically, they are organized crime coming out trying to steal your money, right? So it's not just like some teenager in his mom's basement trying to hack your account anymore. But more recently, we're seeing state actors. There's, at the time of this recording, Iran was trying to do some nefarious stuff, doing some cyber attacks here, and for most private equity firms, they're probably sitting there thinking like, I'm not worried about that. They're not coming after me. They're going after these bigger companies or whatever. But that's probably not true, right? If they're coming after dollars, right? And by the way, private equity, you are the engine that's running a lot of, if I'm putting money into a lot of, tech companies and other innovators. So let's get into this. Like, talk to us about like what is happening. What are you seeing from a threat perspective from these actors, and what's happening to try to stop it?
Yeah, totally. Typically, when you think about fraud and, some of these adversarial problems, like a lot of mental model is just a solo person. And yes, with AI, a single individual can become more powerful. But yeah, it can run the spectrum of, right, a low level street gang, but, all the way up to truly nation state, truly state sponsored activity. And it is, when people think of security, they think of breaking into systems. With fraud, you think of stealing money. All of that's being done by state actors right now. And so, right, very recent, top of mind, in early 2026, right, we see this, obviously there's a conflict happening in the Middle East, and you do see, right, there's the recent news around Iran as a nation state, infiltrating very large device company Striker. But even before that, right, you can find articles about North Korean state actors trying to infiltrate employee systems or corporate systems in the United States through the hiring process. Anthropic, one of the top, names in the AI space, released a great threat intelligence report a few months back about a nation state actor, later determined to be People's Republic of China related nation state actor. They published a report about how that nation state was using their own product to basically conduct an intelligence operation. And so, yeah, I mean, this is industrialized, professional grade, weaponization of AI. It's not hyperbole to say that, right? This is really like weapons grade, use of AI. And right, it is important, when you are thinking about something like infiltrating a corporate system, right? These fraudsters are also going after grandma, right? So they're like, private equity is a great person for them to go after as well. There's no remorse here.
Yeah.
Right. We don't think like, most of us day to day don't think like criminals, or a military operation. So yeah, I mean, private equity, if you're there thinking that you're not a target, you absolutely are.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so earlier off camera, we were talking about something that you said was called melding adversarial approaches or techniques to kind of disrupt this type of stuff or defend against this type of stuff. And I wonder if you could, like, first time I've heard it phrased that way. So I wonder if you could kind of dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think maybe Peter can speak to this, just given his background. Like, he'll be able to dive deeper into this, just given the background at RSA, most likely. But yeah, I mean, the thing I think about when you're trying to think of countermeasures to novel sorts of fraud problems, where you can get a lot of magic, is when you're able to blend together two different adversarial disciplines. And so, just to be a little bit less abstract, right? When you think of security, you're thinking chiefly about protecting systems and protecting hardware, protecting data. When you think about like fraud risk, you're typically, the types of you're thinking about essentially preventing deception. There is some systems level thinking that you're protecting against, but that's a domain that's heavy on statistics and machine learning and almost like a cat and mouse kind of, I'm trying to trick you, I'm going to try to catch your tricks. Whereas security is a sort of protection of systems and data. And so, right, melding those two together, I think, right, Peter, maybe you can speak to sort of how you're doing this at 6lock, because I do think it's one of the few tools that you have available if you're on this sort of like receiving end of a lot of bad actors.
Yeah. Those are all really good points. I think the solution needs to be comprehensive. We talked a little bit about the bad actors and all of the powerful tools they have. So given that situation, you need to have more powerful tools on your side as well. And that's really what we've done with 6lock. We've combined strong authentication with identity verification and authorization and an audit and tracking capability. So being able to combine some of the security discipline with some of the anti-fraud measures and signals that we get with Persona, that combination is very powerful as a defensive mechanism against, what are very powerful adversaries that are trying to disrupt your systems.
Okay, I want to switch gears here to something really interesting because, obviously our target market and target audience here is the private markets and particularly in private equity. You're like, hey, we want you to be more secure. We want you to think about these concepts a little bit more. But it's also kind of fun to occasionally talk to the industry as a whole. And Vivek, you mentioned that in our prep call that Austin is a place that you've seen rising in importance for this space. And so I'd love to get like a feel for what you're seeing, because you're not here in Austin. Peter and I are. So that kind of got both of us going, oh, he's talking awesome about our place. So let's hear a little bit about it, because I think this is important. Like, we do see nexuses of specific industries grow. And by the way, Austin has a very robust private equity market as well here. Lots of providers are here. So let's dive into it. Like, maybe, both of you kind of give your vantage point of what you're seeing in this space and why Austin's so important for security.
So yeah. I don't know if it's risky for a Californian to talk about Austin. That may not always be like the most well-received thing. But Peter, you want to go? You want to go first?
Sure.
That's funny.
He's
thinking about his own security there. That's what's happening.
I lived in California for a long time as well. So I think when back in the late 90s, early 2000s, Silicon Valley was really kind of the only game in town. And that's expanded. Obviously, Seattle has a huge tech presence. Austin has grown. I've been here for 13 years. When I first got here, it was not what it is now. So we're seeing more talent. We're seeing more young companies, innovative companies in the security space kind of starting to blossom out of Austin. And it's still a strong connection with Silicon Valley and with California, I would say. The two cities are kind of sister cities in a lot of different ways.
Love it. I love it. Well, listen, Vivek, we got breakfast tacos here. It's great. You'd love it. It's awesome stuff. Anyway, okay, that was fun. We had a little plug for Austin, but it is interesting to me when you see these nexuses. We had a guest on a few episodes back from Columbia Threadneedle, which is, and he's based out in Huntington Beach, California, and it's like this private credit mover and shaker. You know what I mean? They're moving a lot of these collateralized loan obligations around and trading that type of stuff, and I'm just like, how the heck does that end up out there at the beach, right? Doesn't that feel like it should be something in New York? And then with this whole explanation of it, and so I'm always fascinated by like, how do these little nexuses of places grow up and become like really influential? And so it's kind of fun to be here in one of those. All right, so closing thoughts. What do you get from you both before we let you go? What does like a world with real identity infrastructure look like? Because we talked about it a little bit here, but it may still feel a little abstract for the audience, right? Because so what does that mean? Like, if we have we're locked and loaded so that I know that the identity of who I'm moving money to is secure, that they know that I'm the right person that they're interacting with. From your vantage point, what does that look like?
It's really, not to get too abstract, like it's really about knowing who's on the other end of the transaction. We have a lot of information floating out about us, on the internet. Example of that is a lot of passwords are compromised. They're published on the dark web. So there's personal information that PII, that is important information that gets disseminated, right, by using the internet, just by using the internet. And so we need to really take extra steps to know who's on the other side. I think that's the most important way to look at it is when you want to do a financial transaction, you've got to know who you're dealing with on the other side. Really, kind of at the end of the day, that's what it really boils down.
Love it.
Yeah,
What do you
I guess what I would say, I'm not a futurist, VC here, but yeah, I mean, I think just, yeah, thinking about with sort of a future world with, right, some of the things we talked about with agent to agent commerce or, yeah, or just the sort of AI enabled scams. Like we are in this S curve, and I do think there'll be hard lessons learned along the way. I think it'll be important for like, right, as an industry, right, if you're right, a fraud leader at a bank or a GP at a private equity fund, like you're part of industry too, but also if you're a vendor that provides fraud or identity or authentication related solutions too. It's going to be like industry coming together and coming up with solutions. Like, I think a good mental model is I think about, as my gray hair is showing here, right? I remember when when there was first a computer in my house, and you think even 20 years ago, right, early 2000s, the idea of putting your credit card number to buy something in like on an e-commerce website, like pre-Amazon or just, pre a lot of the names we have now, that was a little risky, right? You only
Yeah.
had a few people willing to take that risk, or maybe use something like PayPal, back in the day in order to accomplish that. Like, I think about that a lot now, which is like, in order now you don't think twice. Like, in
Yeah.
fact, you probably would prefer to put your credit card in because there's a lot of infrastructure that's been built around that. The way that the data is handled, or the way it's encrypted, or the way that payment tokens are passed
Yeah.
between institutions, just like the whole chargeback system in credit cards just serves as like a risk infrastructure for consumers. And so I think you're going to see totally new layers of how that's going to be done. But there's probably going to be some scams along the way, some
Yeah.
losses
Yeah.
along the way, some big events. And right, it's up to industry to sort of like, I think do that. I think like, thinking about markets, right? Like we're the sort of motive force that's going to make this happen. And so I don't know exactly what it'll look like, but
Yeah.
I think it's a good mental model just to think about where we've gone and even, a short period, in this century.
Yeah, I love it. I gotta say, one of the things that's really encouraging is hearing the two of you talk about it now, right? Before, in the early stages of, hey, as you mentioned a couple of times, Vivek, throughout the show, hey, anytime a new technology pops up, and we're talking about AI specifically, the fraudsters are going to try to get in there. And so that you have two people like yourself that are out there advocating and speaking loudly about this. Like, hey, these are some things you need to be thinking about. And there are some solutions in place that are ahead of the bad guys, or at least keeping pace with the bad guys. Awesome, awesome stuff. So this has been an amazing show. I'm sure people are going to want to follow up and follow along. Vivek, where's the best place for people to kind of follow up and follow along with you?
Yeah, I would definitely just, right, if you want to, give me a follow on LinkedIn or just follow Persona. I love sharing, just what our team's seeing on the ground, some of the original research that we're putting out there, maybe sharing some of my perspective or spin on it. So that's going to be the best place for me, right? My x.com account's been dormant for a couple of years now.
There you go. And yourself, Peter? That's great.
Yeah, LinkedIn, I try to publish things that I see in the industry and help people stay kind of up to date with some of the things that we're seeing.
Awesome stuff. Well, gentlemen, this has been a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate the two of you. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.